Hello, and welcome to this lecture, Japanese Animation and War. Now, the first thing I have to do is just emphasize that not everything during this time period was about war. Increasingly, as the war went on, there were less and less comics that had nothing to do with war, right? As time goes on, as there's pressure, both legal and social, to support the war effort, of course, there's going to be fewer, but there are exceptions. One of these is one of Japan's longest running comic strips, Little Fuku by Ryuichi Yokoyama, and this is 1942, so this is when the war is well underway. And you have this very, kind of lighthearted. He looks at himself in the mirror. He wonders what he looked like with a mustache, so he paints it on, leaves it down here, and then I suppose that's his father. Has a look at it and suddenly has a mustache. Okay, so I just want us to understand not everything in this time period directly deals with war. One thing that we need to note, though, first of all, and this goes back to the lecture, the kind of background lecture I gave, is that you have a kind of overall worldview that is shown in these comics, and it has to do with Japan's understanding of itself as a multi-ethnic empire in which you have groups that are similar enough that they should be unified, but different enough in terms of their ability that Japan has to lead. Right? So remember, you have this idea of, the Manchurians, the Chinese, and the Japanese kind of working together. You have ideas of Koreans and Japanese working together, but the Japanese are always the leading partner. So this creates kind of a tension, right? We're similar enough that we should be together. We're different enough, though, that we have to be in charge, or rather, we Japanese are superior. And it's important to be on the lookout for this kind of thing as you're watching these comics and cartoons, because is key to understanding them. And one thing that's very interesting, I think, you can see this in Dankichi, which is this boy here, by Keizo Shimada, which is a comic that ran in the late 30s, had its own animation. You'll watch one from it. But you can see here, this is little boy Dankichi. He goes to an island in the South Pacific. He meets the native people, and he defeats the king in like a contest, and that leads to him becoming king. And what's interesting about this comic is there's always this relationship between Dankichi, the native peoples, and then the mice and other animals. And one thing I think is very interesting, of course, is that after he kind of takes over, he has the native people build a Shinto shrine. There is King Dankichi with the Japanese flag, and you can see the shrine here. Or this is not the shrine, I'm sorry, this is the Tori, the gate to the shrine. Whenever you see that, that's a sign that you're coming up on a shrine. So, you've got these kinds of ideas of empire connecting with the animation. Like I said, you have to think of this time period. The Japanese empire understands itself as a multicultural, multi-ethnic empire. So, another example of what's kind of being developed during this time period is the Norakuro series. Norakuro literally means like black stray. And it's referring to like a stray dog, and that's created by this man, Suiho Tagawa. Suiho is an interesting man. He created Norakuro as like a military dog. Norakuro serves in the army. And of course, Suiho Tagawa, and this is one thing we have to remember, all men during this time period, as long as they were physically fit, were liable to service in the Japanese military, right? They maybe wouldn't call you up, but the Japanese military was fairly large. It had an empire, after all, to defend. And all men, if the government wanted them to, even if it was not during the time of war, could call them into the army, right? So there was a peacetime draft, peacetime conscription, and he served his time in the military, and it seems like used some of that to build up his character. So you can see here an image of Norakuro from the manga version. He also had cartoons. But I like this. I've just ordered an all-out attack. Your platoon will hit the enemy first. So that Norakuro is like a lieutenant. Is at last, yes, sir, I'm on my way, sir. And for whatever reason, Norakuro has an umbrella. It's not clear to me if he's lost his sword. I think this might be a sword. But in any case, he has an umbrella. And the joke, it's meant to be kind of humorous. But what happens is the war progresses. it kind of takes on a darker cast, and you can kind of see that here. And in this comic strip, Norakuro and his men are marching into battle, and they're fighting pigs. This pig has eggs for some reason. I think they're just kind of poking fun at the pigs being rather silly. But one thing I want to stress here, pigs means Chinese people, right? That they are representing Chinese forces that Japan is now fighting. And when you understand it in this way, you can kind of see the negativity of some of these images, or what we would see is that you can see them reinforcing this kind of empire and this kind of animal symbolism that you see in a lot of Japanese comics. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details about the laws and things like that, but there was increasing legal pressure to make your comics and animation support the war effort. And one thing I want to stress, there was also incredible social pressure to do this, right? There's always a kind of pressure to conform from society. In Japanese culture, it's no different. In fact, there's a famous saying in Japanese culture, the nail that stands up gets hammered down, right? The nail that stands up gets hammered down. You need to conform. And so artists, animators are under this intense pressure to make things like this image you see here. Now, this takes the war, though, it can impact things in a lot of different ways. So we want to understand that comic art and animation is not going to always be behaving in the same way. So, for example, this is an image from a manga entitled The Science Warrior Appears in New York by Ryuichi Yokoyama in 1943. So this is when things were not really going Japan's way. And, I mean, you can kind of tell what's going on from the title. The Japanese build this really cool robot and then use it to smash New York City. And I think you could say this is a kind of fantasy. And it's fascinating because not only is it in itself just a fantasy about winning the war, it's the idea of how we're going to do it by our advanced technology. Of course, the Americans at this time outclassed Japan in terms of technology, but, you know, that just adds that element of fantasy. And you can kind of see the beginnings of mech comics here. In addition, comics could have a very clear didactic purpose. This one is entitled An Elder Brother's Duty. These sinographs, these Chinese characters here say temptation. If you're not sure what this is a beer bottle. And basically you have this older brother protecting the young workers. And this literally says Shonen Kong, I think. The problem is I read these with, these are Chinese characters, but you can read them with Japanese, Chinese, or Korean pronunciations. I know the Korean ones. But if you're familiar with like the comic Shonen Jump, it means youth. This means youth workers. So during this time period, of course, they were calling up, if you were a boy who was too young to fight or who couldn't because of health reasons, they would call you up to work for the government, to be like in the military. Or, I'm sorry, to be in the factory. And you might be tempted there, but this good worker is doing his duty. Now, it's interesting because you could read this comic in a couple ways. One is simply that it's telling these boys don't drink alcohol, but it's also telling workers, hey, don't corrupt the boys. Don't get these boys drinking. Be a good older brother and take care of them. But that's an example of the kind of didactic comics that they would be producing to help serve the war effort. Curiously, they also made propaganda comics. This is in English, but this was created by Japanese artists who are part of the propaganda, creating propaganda. And you have here this Australian, he hears a scream, and he says, what was that scream? Something up, and he's off fighting in New Guinea, while there's American troops stationed in Australia, and the Yank says, the American says, shh, quiet girlie, calm yourself. He'll be on the next casualty list, so he'll be dead soon, no worry. So the idea here is, hey, Australians, you're off fighting in New Guinea while the Americans are taking your women back home in Australia. What are you doing? You need to get out of here. And this is the kind of propaganda that the Japanese would make artists would make to try and get the Americans to kind of give up. And I don't know if this person has their heart in it or what. I mean, this is meant to appeal to Australians. Why? I don't know why they made the Australian soldier just look so terrible and ugly. I mean, I can understand showing him as tired from fighting, but it's kind of curious why they did that. And I don't see this propaganda being particularly effective. But one thing, and this goes back to this whole text and subtext thing that we've been talking about previously. So you have this comic, Mr. Promotion by Ichio Matsushita. And in this comic, you've got Mr. Promotion here, and he's sad. And what he's doing is he's thinking and reminiscing about Admiral Yamamoto, the man who had planned successfully the Pearl Harbor attack. He came up with a plan for it and was a very important Japanese admiral, but would be killed. Basically, the Americans, we found out where his plane was going, and we intercepted it, shot it down. And so he's sad about that. But in panel 2, there's a problem. The workers are unhappy and need to be inspired. So basically all the different supervisors come in and say, "Would you please make slogans for us?" And he comes up with slogans saying like, let's do our best for the empire and things like that. And then they go off to inspire the workers. Now, what I think is fascinating about this comic is how well drawn it is. This is really good, I think. The action, this is someone who knows what they're doing. This is not something that's just a crude comic. But good Lord, is the writing terrible? It's like, this is, wow. It's just not a very interesting story at all. And I almost wonder if it's a kind of protest by the artist to say, if you're going to make me do these terrible things, I'm just going to make them really bad. And that's where we can kind of see this text and subtext. And one thing we want to understand is that you could be an artist or an animator, and this is in any society, it's just very clear in Japan during this time period, and for various reasons you may be forced to do work you don't want to do, but you can't think of a way out of it, and you just do it. And I'll give you another example of that later on, but I want to highlight that whole idea of text and subtext and just being aware of that. Now, what ends up happening, it's really fascinating. There is a movie that Disney makes that we don't really talk about in this class called Fantasia. We'll maybe mention a little bit later. We haven't talked about it so yet, but Disney will make this very beautifully animated film that was a flop at the box office called Fantasia in 1940. In 1941, Japan attacks the United States and then captures various American ships, and one of them had a print of Fantasia. And what happened was the Japanese Navy, of course, got a hold of that print when they captured the ship, and they called together a bunch of Japanese animators and had a secret screening to show them what the Americans were doing, and basically said, we need to do something like this. This is amazing, right? We need propaganda like this. We need to kind of use these advanced techniques that the Americans are using, but we're going to make a really awesome Japanese animation, right? We're going to show we're just as good as them. We're going to make some good propaganda. And there's a report that one animator wept during this screening. It's not clear exactly why, but it was probably several reasons. One was just maybe he was moved by what was going on in the story, but also just he was very impressed. A man named Keiji Nakazawa, who would suffer through the bombing of Hiroshima, later talked about how after World War II, he watched Snow White in a movie theater, and he said, why did we ever think we could beat the Americans when they had the technical ability to make something like this? But that was an inspiration, and it helped lead to kind of competition. The Japanese want to prove they can do it too. In addition, what's really striking is the Chinese are also making cartoons. I don't want to talk too much about this because this focus in this class is Japan and the United States, but I do want to note that you have these two brothers, the Wan brothers, and they produced this film called Princess Iron Fan, which is loosely based on the Journey to the West, which I believe is also what Dragon Ball Z is based on. But this was produced in 1941. It would be a major influence on Osamu Tezuka, the guy who made Astro Boy, who we'll talk more about later. But the Chinese, under wartime conditions, in 1941, made this beautiful animation, which called on Chinese people to unify to defeat Japan. But when the Wan brothers found out the Chinese were coming, or the Japanese were going to invade Shanghai, they edited the cartoon really quickly to protect themselves. But the message still in many ways got through. But the key thing was the Japanese are being exposed to American and Chinese wonderful examples of animation and are inspired to try and compete and be able to make their own great animation. And that will lead to the production in 1943 of Momotaro's Sea Eagles. Remember Momotaro? Peach Boy? We saw videos of him earlier. So this is kind of a revision of him. The year sometime, there it says 1942. I've heard the year 1943. It's in that time period. But this man, Seo Mitsuyo, pictured here on the left, is going to be the one who is brought in to animate this. And he's an example, I think, of some of the kind of pressure. Seo Mitsuyo had actually been involved in leftist politics. He had worked with what was called, like, I believe it's the Proletariat Film Association, which tried to use cartoons and other film products to call for change, even revolution in Japan. It's complex. I don't think he was actually a communist, but he was certainly influenced by socialism and Marxist ideas. Because of that, he was arrested and imprisoned for, I think, 3 weeks and tortured. This is in 1931. And so he learned to just, not to fight back, but I don't think he ever gave up his ideals to a certain extent. And so he is going to work in animating this project. And you can see kind of this difficulty you have. You have this artist who is called in to animate a project he maybe doesn't believe a whole lot in. And one thing I want to stress, the Navy, the Japanese Navy is who funds this. That's why it's called Momotaro's Sea Eagles, because it's all focused on the Navy. And it's basically a kind of... it's an animated fantasy depiction of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Right? So when you watch this, you want to understand this is supposed to represent the attack on Pearl Harbor as if it had been led by Momotaro. And like I said, it's funded by the Navy, animated by this guy who'd at least previously been on the political left, for whatever reason is willing to work with the Navy, but I don't think he particularly likes it. But one thing I want to stress about Momotaro's Sea Eagles was its significance. It was extraordinarily popular. Right? It was a very, very popular cartoon. Now, kids were kind of forced to watch it because it was propaganda, but they seemed to have enjoyed it. And we do have anecdotal evidence of how much they liked it. And we do also have evidence that theater owners complained that there were too many kids watching the movies and they tore up the seats. It's also phenomenal technical achievement. When you watch it, think about the Japanese comics we've watched so far. The animation is comparatively smooth. It is a monochrome black and white cartoon, but it's really well done. And it did so well that it led to a sequel in 1945, Momotaro's Divine Warriors, which is a feature-length film. It's long. It's like an hour and 15 minutes long, and is in many ways even better in terms of the technical achievements than this film. The Japanese Navy was willing to put a lot of money into this. And a man named Mochinaga Tadahito, who worked with Seo Mitsuyo on this film, had a lot of regret about making it. He writes, "I heard that many youths volunteered for the Flying Corps and that while they were on duty, they died on air raids. I wonder whether the films that we made influenced their decision to volunteer. I thought in the future I only wished to make a film that would benefit the young, difficult though that might be." And one thing I want to stress, he also talked about how he tried to rationalize what he was doing by reminding himself that he said that a Disney cartoon featured Donald Duck blowing up a Japanese ship. I don't know if that happened, but certainly American cartoon characters did fight the Japanese. So it's this kind of sadness, I think, that you can view this because, like I said, technically it's really beautiful. It shows a kind of maturity, a development in Japanese film, and there are some nice points to it. But at the same time, it is, in a sense, glorifying the attack on Pearl Harbor, which was, the day that will live in infamy. And it does kind of play into this kind of militarism and maybe did directly or indirectly help lead Japanese young people to embrace choices that would lead eventually to their deaths. So this will hopefully get you ready to watch and critique these films.